If you have ever promised yourself at this time you will eat better, save more money, stop procrastinating, or finally stay consistent, only to break that promise days or even hours later, this book is for you. Most of us believe that willpower is something we either have or don't have. We see it as a personal flaw, a moral weakness, or a lack of discipline. But what if that belief itself is the problem? In The Willpower Instinct, Kelly McGonigal shows us that willpower is not about being tougher, harsher, or more self-critical. It is a biological and psychological skill rooted in how the brain and body work. And the most surprising insight is this: many of the strategies we believe strengthen willpower actually weaken it. This book is based on McGonigal's popular Stanford course, where people from all walks of life learn how self-control truly works and why we fail so predictably. The goal is not perfection. The goal is understanding. Because once you understand how willpower really functions, you can stop fighting yourself and start working with your brain instead of against it. Chapter 1. I will, I won't, I want. What willpower is and why it matters. When most people think about willpower, they think about resisting temptation. They picture saying no to junk food, distractions, impulses, or bad habits. Kelly McGonigal begins by explaining that this is only one part of willpower, which she calls I won't power. It is the ability to stop yourself from doing something that feels good now, but harms you later. But willpower is much broader than resistance alone. There is also I will power, the ability to make yourself do things you don't feel like doing. This includes getting out of bed, to exercise, starting difficult work, having uncomfortable conversations, or following through on long-term goals. Procrastination is not a lack of knowledge. It is a failure of I will power. There is a third and most essential component of willpower. I want power. This is the ability to remember what truly matters to you when temptation or discomfort appears. In the moment of craving or avoidance, the brain narrows its focus to immediate relief. I want power reconnects you to your deeper goals: health, freedom, financial security, self-respect, relationships, and meaning. True willpower is the ability to balance these three powers. It is not about becoming cold or rigid. It is about choosing which desires deserve your attention and energy. McGonigal explains that willpower evolved because humans needed to live in groups. Cooperation, trust, long-term planning, and social harmony required the ability to control impulses. Over time, the human brain developed a powerful region behind the forehead called the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is responsible for planning, focus, impulse control, emotional regulation, and decision-making. However, the brain is not a single unified system. We have competing parts. One part of us seeks comfort, pleasure, and safety in the present moment. Another part is concerned with long-term outcomes. Every willpower challenge is a conflict between these two selves. The problem is not that one self is bad. The problem is that they want different things. The foundation of willpower is self-awareness. You cannot control a behavior if you do not notice it happening. Most of our daily choices are made automatically, without conscious reflection. Learning to recognize when a decision matters is the first step towards self-control. Chapter 2. The Willpower Instinct. Your body was born to resist cheesecake. Willpower is not just a mental struggle. It is a physical state. When temptation appears, the body reacts before conscious reasoning has a chance to intervene. McGonigal explains that self-control depends on which biological response is active in the body. The first response is the fight-or-flight response, designed to deal with danger. When this system is activated, stress hormones flood the body, the heart rate increases, and the rational part of the brain becomes less active. This response makes you impulsive, reactive, and focused on immediate survival. It is useful for emergencies, but disastrous for self-control. The second response is what McGonigal calls the pause-and-plan response. This is the biological state of willpower. In this state, the nervous system calms down, the heart rate stabilizes, and the prefrontal cortex becomes more active. You gain the ability to pause, observe urges, and make deliberate choices. Modern life constantly triggers stress rather than calm. Deadlines, notifications, social pressure, lack of sleep, and constant stimulation push the body into a chronic fight-or-flight state. In this condition, willpower becomes extremely difficult. One of the most effective ways to strengthen willpower is learning how to activate the pause and plan response. Simple practices like slow breathing, mindfulness, and meditation help regulate the nervous system. Even a few minutes of focused breathing can restore self-control by shifting the body out of stress mode. Willpower is not about forcing better behavior. It is about creating the internal conditions that make better behavior possible. Chapter 3. Too Tired to Resist. Why self-control is like a muscle. Self-control requires energy. When you use willpower repeatedly without rest, it becomes temporarily depleted. This phenomenon is often described as ego depletion. After exerting self-control in one area, people are more likely to give in somewhere else. For example, someone who resists unhealthy food all day may later procrastinate, overspend, or lose patience. The problem is not hypocrisy, it is fatigue. The brain's self-control system has been overworked. However, willpower is not permanently limited. Like a muscle, it becomes stronger with training, but it also requires recovery. Sleep, proper nutrition, relaxation, and positive emotions restore self-control capacity. McGonigal challenges the belief that pushing harder is the solution. Often, people fail not because they lack discipline, but because they are exhausted. Chronic stress, poor sleep, and emotional overload drain the very system responsible for self-control. The most important insight from this chapter is that self-care is not a reward for good behavior. It is a prerequisite for willpower. When you protect your energy, self-control becomes sustainable. Chapter 4. License to Sin. Why being good gives us permission to be bad. One of the most surprising discoveries in behavioral science is moral licensing. When people do something good, they often feel justified in doing something bad afterward. Eating healthy all day can lead to overeating at night. Saving money can justify impulse purchases. Exercising can justify unhealthy food. The brain treats good behavior like earning moral credit. This mental accounting is dangerous because it disconnects actions from long-term goals. Instead of asking, "Does this choice move me closer to what I want?" the brain asks, "Have I earned this?" McGonigal explains that this self-licensing happens unconsciously. People sincerely believe they are making rational decisions, when in reality, they are negotiating with themselves. True self-control comes from consistency, not compensation. Progress is not about balancing good and bad actions. It is about aligning daily choices with long-term values. When behavior is guided by identity rather than rewards, willpower becomes stronger. Chapter 5. The Brain's Big Lie. Why we mistake wanting for happiness. The brain releases dopamine when it anticipates reward. Dopamine does not create pleasure, it creates desire. It motivates action by making the reward feel urgent and important. This is why cravings feel so powerful. The brain exaggerates how good the reward will feel and ignores the potential downsides. Wanting feels like happiness, but it is not the same thing. Research shows that people consistently overestimate how much pleasure indulgence will bring and underestimate regret. The brain is wired to chase, not to evaluate accurately. McGonigal explains that learning to observe cravings changes their power. When you pay attention to what actually happens after giving in, the illusion weakens. Often, the reward is less satisfying than expected, while the consequences last longer. Cravings rise, peak, and fall. They are temporary experiences, not commands. The moment you stop automatically obeying them, you regain choice. This chapter lays the foundation for understanding that willpower is not about denying pleasure, but about seeing desire clearly instead of being misled by it. Chapter 6. What the hell? How feeling bad leads to giving in. One of the most dangerous moments for willpower is not the first mistake. It is the emotional reaction that follows it. Kelly McGonigal calls this the what the hell effect. It happens when a small slip turns into a full collapse. Not because the goal was impossible, but because of how we respond emotionally to failure. Imagine someone trying to eat healthier. They eat one cookie they hadn't planned on eating. Instead of seeing this as a small deviation, the inner voice immediately jumps in. I've ruined everything. I have no discipline. I'll never change. At that point, the goal feels broken. And once the goal feels broken, the brain decides there is no reason to keep trying. One cookie turns into 5, not because of hunger, but because of shame. McGonigal explains that guilt and self-criticism create stress. And as we have already seen, stress weakens the part of the brain responsible for self-control. When people feel bad about themselves, they're more likely to seek comfort, escape, or relief, often in the very behavior they're trying to stop. Eating, drinking, spending, scrolling, or procrastinating temporarily dulls emotional pain. Ironically, the desire to be strict with ourselves often backfires. People believe that being harsh will keep them accountable. But research shows the opposite. Self-compassion, treating yourself with understanding instead of judgment, actually increases responsibility and long-term success. McGonigal points to studies where people who forgave themselves after a setback were far more likely to return to their goals. Self-forgiveness does not mean ignoring consequences or lowering standards. It means recognizing that mistakes are part of being human and choosing to continue rather than quit. The key shift in this chapter is learning to separate the mistake from the meaning we assign to it. A failure is not proof that you are weak or broken. It is information. When you remove shame from the equation, willpower becomes sustainable. Chapter 7. Putting the future on sale. The economics of instant gratification. Human beings are not neutral decision makers. We are biased toward the present moment. The brain naturally values immediate rewards more than future benefits, even when the future rewards are objectively larger. This is why we procrastinate, overspend, overeat, and delay important work. McGonigal explains that the future self feels psychologically distant. Tomorrow does not feel real. Next year feels even less real. As a result, the brain treats future consequences as someone else's problem. When temptation appears, the present self wins the negotiation. This bias explains why people choose short-term comfort over long-term well-being again and again. The pain of effort is immediate. The reward of discipline is delayed. The brain is wired to choose what feels good now. However, this tendency can be reversed. One powerful strategy is making the future feel vivid and emotionally close. When people visualize their future selves clearly, imagining their health, finances, stress levels, or relationships, their decisions change. The future stops being abstract and starts feeling personal. McGonigal also discusses commitment devices, ways of locking in future behavior in advance. This could mean automatic savings, blocking distracting websites, preparing healthy meals ahead of time, or setting public accountability. These tools reduce the number of willpower decisions required in the moment. The lesson of this chapter is not that instant gratification is evil, but that willpower improves when the future becomes emotionally meaningful. When tomorrow feels real, today's choices change. Chapter 8. Infected. Why willpower is contagious. Willpower does not exist in isolation. Human behavior is deeply influenced by social cues, norms, and imitation. We unconsciously copy what the people around us do, especially those we identify with. McGonigal explains that self-control is contagious, but so is indulgence. When we see others giving in, our own resistance weakens. When we see others exercising discipline, it strengthens our resolve. This happens even when we are unaware of the influence. Studies show that habits spread through social networks. Weight gain, smoking, spending behavior, and even procrastination increase when they become normalized in a group. On the other hand, positive changes spread the same way. This means willpower is not just a personal trait. It is an environmental one. Your surroundings constantly nudge you towards certain behaviors. Food on the counter, notifications on your phone, friends' habits, workplace culture, all shape your choices. McGonigal encourages redesigning the environment rather than relying solely on internal discipline. Spend time with people who support your goals. Remove cues that trigger temptation. Make good behavior visible and easy. The core insight is simple but powerful. You are not weak because willpower is hard. You are human. Change the environment, and self-control becomes easier. Chapter 9. Don't read this chapter. The limits of I won't power. Most people believe willpower means saying no, resisting, suppressing, and fighting desire. But this chapter reveals a counterintuitive truth. The harder you try not to think about something, the more power it gains. Psychologists have shown that suppression increases obsession. When people are told not to think about something, that thought becomes more frequent and emotionally charged. The mind constantly checks whether the forbidden thought is still there, keeping it active. This is why strict restriction often backfires. Dieting makes food more tempting. Quitting something through sheer denial can intensify cravings. The brain interprets suppression as deprivation, and deprivation increases desire. McGonigal suggests an alternative approach: acceptance and awareness. Instead of saying, "I can't have this," notice the urge without judgment. Observe how it feels in the body. Recognize that it will rise and fall. Cravings are temporary experiences, not commands. When people learn to sit with discomfort instead of fighting it, urges lose their control. This skill, often trained through mindfulness, allows willpower without force. The message of this chapter is that freedom does not come from constant resistance. It comes from understanding desire without being ruled by it. Chapter 10. Final Thoughts. The final chapter brings all the ideas together into a single perspective. Willpower is not about perfection, toughness, or moral superiority. It is about working with human nature instead of against it. McGonigal emphasizes that self-control improves when we reduce stress, increase awareness, care for our physical and emotional energy, and design our environments wisely. The goal is not to eliminate temptation, but to respond to it skillfully. Willpower strengthens when we stop treating failure as proof of inadequacy and start treating it as feedback. It grows when we replace shame with curiosity, punishment with support, and force with understanding. The book ends with a reassuring message. Struggling with willpower does not mean you are broken. It means you are human. And with the right tools, self-control is not only possible, it is trainable. Willpower is not something you either have or don't have. It is something you build, protect, and refine over time. The biggest lesson from the willpower instinct is simple but powerful. Lasting self-control does not come from forcing yourself harder or criticizing yourself more. It comes from understanding how your mind and body actually work. When you recognize your triggers, manage stress, care for your energy, and treat setbacks with self-compassion, willpower stops feeling like a constant battle. It becomes a skill you can support, train, and rely on. You don't need to become a different person to change your habits. You just need to stop fighting your own humanity and start designing your life in a way that makes the better choice easier.